about the artistic validity of 3D, then frankly, I don't know what will. This delightful downward trend continued into the 70s, the decade's stereoscopic highlight being Paul Morrissey's Flesh for Frankenstein, to which Andy Warhol lent his moniker, but nothing else, as with its 2D sibling Blood for Dracula, in the manner of a man signing a blank canvas for A, the hell of it, and B, profit. Flesh for Frankenstein is actually my favourite 3D film because it perfectly showcases the format's novelty trash aesthetic, boasting Udo Kier dangling offal in the audience's faces whilst imploring them to fuck life in the gallbladder. In the 80s, the Italian stereoscopic western Coming At Ya and the Charles Band cheapy schlocker Parasite 3D, Demi Moore's first starring role, folks, were followed by a slew of horror sequels, all of which appeared to have been released in 3D, largely because producers realised that they already had the numeral 3 in the titles. First out of the gate was the somewhat clumsily named Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D, which was swiftly retitled to the rather more punchy Friday the 13th Part 3D, thus kicking off a titular triptych trend. Linda and I showed Friday the 13th Part 3D, which people forget marks the first time Jason actually dons the now iconic hockey mask, alongside House of Wax and Flesh for Frankenstein at our NFT horror season as part of a 3D triple bill. I mention this again in order to offer proof that, despite everything, I'm not just a total killjoy when it comes to the daft pleasures of stereoscopy. On the contrary, I think there's something stupidly fun about watching horror filmmakers throw eyeballs out of the screen at you and flip dripping gizzards, and of course gallbladders, in your face, but that's all it is, stupid fun. Trashy, schlocky, stupid fun. At least that's what it is at best. At worst, it's Jaws 3D, which followed hot on the heels of Friday the 13th Part 3D, but entirely lacked the sleazy charm of its Dumbo trend-setting predecessors. Whereas Parasite cost less than $800,000 and Friday the 13th Part 3D really pushed out the exploitation boat at $4 million, Jaws 3D was a big-budget, family-friendly venture which cost over $20 million and featured neither extreme gore, wacko weirdness, nor cheesy TNA, the only real reasons to watch a 3D film. Set, boringly, in a SeaWorld theme park, Jaws 3D was an utter stinker that is meant to have begun life as a spoof script entitled Jaws 3 People Nil. According to legend, the story was about a studio struggling to flog a second dead horse sequel to Jaws and opened with author Peter Benchley being eaten alive in his swimming pool. There were also roles for a naked Bo Derek and some space aliens in shark suits, apparently. Joe Dante, who had helmed the Jaws rip-off Piranha, recently remade in 3D with more gratuitous nudity and blood, was tipped to direct, but then Universal got cold feet when they realised that spoofing their biggest hit would be akin to fouling in your own nest. So the joke was over, more's the pity. Instead, cameraman Chris J. Condon, who shot the stewardesses and handled the stereoscopy on Parasite, was enlisted to lens a dull-as-ditchwater straight-faced Jaws knockoff, which respected writer Richard Matheson, who had worked with Spielberg on Duel, would subsequently disown, commenting that the so-called 3D just made the film look murky, it had no effect whatsoever, it was a waste of time. Stop me if you've heard this one. In fact, the most interesting thing about Jaws 3D is the way in which it perfectly illustrates the other great technical flaw of forced stereoscopy, namely the bizarre phenomenon of miniaturization. As fans of Father Ted will know, there are cows that are small and cows that are far away, and our brains are usually able to distinguish between the two thanks to a range of visual and oral information that is in no way hampered by monocularity. Occasionally we can be fooled. There are loads of monster movies which have attempted to convince audiences that giant beasties are terrorising normal-sized people by, for example, holding a lobster very close to the camera and getting the actors to stand very far away and scream into mid-air. It may work for a moment, but pretty quickly our brains do the maths and realise it's just a crap perspective trick, which is why so many monster movies only show their monsters for a very short time indeed. With 3D cinema, the problem is compounded by the fact that eye-catching stereoscopy only really kicks in if an object is really quite close to us, way in front of the point of convergence upon which the right and left images match up. Although forced parallax can make background seem comparatively far away, it is only foreground action, on or in front of the point of convergence, that audiences actually tend to notice, justifying the use of those bloody silly glasses for which, incidentally, they've just paid a bloody silly price. Thus, 3D filmmakers traditionally like to wave things right in front of our eyes at regular intervals. Hence the infamous paddleball sequence from House of Wax, which has nothing whatsoever to do with the plot, but which is invariably the one 3D trick everyone remembers after seeing the movie. In the case of Jaws 3D, director Joe Alvis clearly understood that, given the crap title, people were going to come to see the shark in 3D, and thus he and Chris Condon set about making the fish leap out of the screen at the audience in time-honoured tradition. The problem was that this particular shark was meant to be about 35 foot long, a whopper even by great white standards, and conveying this sense of size whilst making the most of the 3D illusion was never going to be easy. The more three-dimensional the shark got, the closer it appeared to be, and therefore the smaller it looked. Only in the long shots, where the stereoscopy had little effect other than depth, did the shark look suitably sizable. In all the close-ups, it just looked like an angry guppy, attempting to bite your nose off whilst hanging in mid-air about 3 feet in front of your face. The effect was hardly jaw-dropping. Watching the movie in 1983 at the Cine City Cinema in Withington, Manchester, I remember actually attempting to swat the irritating minnow-like monster out of my immediate field of vision. The 3D was clearly working, but not in the way the filmmakers wanted. Jaws 3, D nil. Having proved a thoroughly damp squib at the box office, the film took less than $90 million worldwide compared to the $470 million taken by the 2D Jaws, or even the $209 million taken by the utterly rubbish Jaws 2, and being kicked around town by critics. It was nominated for 5 Razzies including Worst Film. Jaws 3D sank without trace, taking stereoscopic cinema down with it, the third time the process had tried and failed to become the new future of cinema. Considering its previous failures, one may ask why any major studio, such as Universal, who owned the Jaws franchise, would have tried to revive 3D in the first place. The last time the answer had been television, this time it was home video. Toward the end of the 70s, VCRs, which had been around as an unwieldy and hugely expensive accessory for some time, gradually started to look like a viable and affordable home viewing option. Although initially thrilled that they could sell feature films to video stores at around £80 a pop, the studio soon realised that the prospect of staying at home and watching a movie was rapidly becoming more appealing than paying through the nose for the privilege of seeing a film in a multiplex screen the size of a shoebox. If you could rent a video for £1.25 or £2.50 a night and invite your friends and family to watch it with you, then why on earth would you pay to go to the cinema where the screen was the same size as your TV? I remember coughing up £4 to see The Evil Dead in a barely functioning cinema at the Screen 1 to 5 in Manchester in the early 80s, and then passing a video store on the way home which would have rented it to me and my assembled mates for £1. Luckily, I didn't have a video machine at the time, but if I had, I would have gone straight back to the cinema and demanded my money back. Some patrons did just that, and in the wake of the popularity of The Evil Dead on video, cinema distributors started demanding a fiercely guarded theatrical window, the length of which remains a hotly contested issue to this day. As it happened in the 50s, the solution to the problem of exponentially declining cinema ticket sales was to attempt to make the theatrical experience something worth paying for. If you're old enough to remember just how lousy most British multiplexes were in the early 80s, then you'll remember how rapidly they smartened up their act as the age of video dawned. Whereas in the 70s single-screen cinemas had simply been partitioned off to run more films on smaller screens, the later 80s saw a return to the kind of spectacular widescreen entertainment that had saved the day 30 years earlier. This was the decade in which Lucas and Spielberg served up such circus-like fare as the Indiana Jones movies, which revelled in unabashed on-screen spectacle and went to town with stereo and surround sound. Lucas may be a terrible director, but he was a brilliant producer who really understood the art of noise, and the rise of his trademark THX-certified sound systems put paid to the god-awful tinny whining most people had come to expect from disheartening trips to the movies. While cinema in the 50s had widened its horizons by widening its screens, in the 80s it promised to immerse the audience further in a blissful sea of sound. For, as radio graduate Orson Welles famously observed, the best pictures are the ones you see with your ears. Once again, the small screen had apparently threatened the future of cinema. Once again, cinema had responded by upping its game and offering audiences a more immersive and spectacular theatrical experience. And once again, 3D turned out to be nothing more than a dead end, the wrong answer to the eternal question of what people really want from the movies. But wait, I hear the massed ranks cry, aren't you just being a miserable Luddite, a facetious technophobe, an old fart who longs for the good old days and hates any form of change? If you're so against 3D, then why not rail against the advent of colour or sound? Weren't these once little more than exotic gimmicks which the naysayers claimed would never catch on? What about the cynics who complained that the arrival of talkies would herald the death of proper cinema, or that the shadowy majesty of monochrome cinematography could never be matched by the fancy schmancy addition of reds and greens and heaven forbid blues? Why don't we just go back to the black and white silent movies with live musical accompaniment? That would make you happy, wouldn't it, you miserable curmudgeonly old bastard? Well, to be honest, yes it would, at least up to a point. As someone who spent quite a lot of time accompanying silent movies, I have indeed been thrilled by the resurgence of interest in these oft-forgotten works that seems to have flourished since the turn of the century. Spurred on by the retrospective fervour that attended the 100th anniversary of the invention of cinema, a moving feast which seemed to last from 1996 to 2003, depending on whose history books you were reading, many modern moviegoers were inspired to seek out reissued silent gems and to experience the wonder of a live soundtrack firsthand. It wasn't just cineasts who got in on the act. In 2004, the Pet Shop Boys unveiled their new score for Eisenstein's 1925 classic Battleship Potemkin at a free concert and screening in Trafalgar Square, at which packed crowds heard the Dresdner Symphonica accompany a movie many of them had probably never seen before. In 2007, I introduced Robert Ziegler conducting the Matrix Ensemble for a live performance of Joby Talbot's newly written score for Alfred Hitchcock's The Lodger at the popular Latitude Festival, where a packed field of revellers was hushed in awe by the spectacle of sight and sound. And earlier this year, to my enormous pride, I got to introduce a screening of Blackmail at a packed Barbican Centre, where the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra played Neil Brand's spine-tingling and often wonderfully comedic score, the first new orchestral score to have been commissioned for a British silent drama since the advent of sound. I was even persuaded to look again at Giorgio Moroder's attempts to make Metropolis relevant to a modern audience by slapping a blooping synth-pop score interspersed with offerings from the likes of Adam Ant all over it, although I must confess that I remain unimpressed by its alleged charms. One of the most rewarding moments of my career came when my skiffle band, the Dodge Brothers, teamed up with Neil Brand to present a live accompaniment to the long-forgotten Louise Brooks movie Beggars of Life at a uniquely carbon-neutral screening as part of the inaugural New Forest Film Festival in September 2010. The movie itself is a surprisingly gritty gem, a 1928 tale of a hobo who goes on the run with a young waif after she kills her stepfather, by whom she has been repeatedly molested. In order to disguise his new companion, our hero, handsomely played by Richard Arlen, advises her to dress like a boy, at which point Brooks dons an old hat and battered trouser suit and somehow becomes even more stunningly beautiful than she was before. People talk about movie stars having the ability to draw the camera's eye, but few have ever managed this trick as well as Brooks. The camera doesn't just look at her, it falls in love with her, brings her flowers, recites poetry outside her balcony, and finally offers to cut off its own ear in service to her radiant charms. Conjoined in their outsider status, our star-crossed couple hit the rails, their paths intermingling with those of a bunch of drunken renegades led by the top-billed Wallace Beery, perhaps best known to younger audiences through a passing reference in the Coen brothers' best film Barton Fink, where the titular scribe is told by his cigar-chomping boss, "It's a Wallace Beery wrestling picture, for Christ's sakes, you know the drill, big men in tights." Everything becomes spectacularly twisted, and it ends up with kangaroo courts, love and death struggles, and an almighty train wreck featuring a real train really falling down a really large ravine. For real. Apparently the wreckage is still out there, a twisted heap in the Carrizo Gorge somewhere in the desert of Southern California. Brooks, who performed her own stunts, including running along the boards of the moving train, was rightly told to be afraid of director William Wellman because he's a maniac. As it turned out, she was more than a match for his much-vaunted madness. Anyway, back to the New Forest Film Festival. Because the festival had a mandate to be sustainable, someone came up with the bright idea of powering the projector by bicycle. A few months earlier, Linda and I had seen someone furiously pedalling away on a